Welcome to Fields of Consciousness, a podcast for consciousness conversations with your host, myself, Jeffrey Stegman.
And I'm Clayton Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focus Life Force Energy, we're here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level.
In this episode, we talk about shadow. We define it, and we give 5 practical steps for you to understand your shadow and begin to transcend it.
Welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you with us. I'm Jeffrey Stegman.
And I'm Clayton Stedman.
Today we're going to talk about personal evolution of consciousness. The FLFE mission is supporting the evolution of consciousness in an economized society, meaning in our everyday life of working and things that we need to do to pay the bills. So what do we mean by evolution of consciousness there, Clayton?
Well, there's lots of ways to describe this. Depending on what background you come from, we'll try to cover a number of different language preferences, we'll call them. Some people would call the evolution of consciousness a rise in vibration. Some people might call it a rise in consciousness. If you talk a lot about consciousness, we use that term a lot at FLFE. We use typically the Hawkins scale of consciousness created by Dr. David Hawkins. We use that a lot. And on that scale, it's a logarithmic scale from 0 or 1, actually, to infinity. And 1 to 1,000 is the human domain. 200 is courage. 400 is reason. 600 is enlightenment. So if we're talking about going from 400 out of 1,000 on the Hawkins scale of consciousness to 500 or 600, then you are talking about a rise in consciousness. And you could use that on that same way of thinking about any other scale that you want to talk about. And on a practical day-to-day life, language, we talk about an increase in joy, an increase in peace, an increase in fulfilling relationships, or clarity of purpose, the ability to consciously create the future that is for the greater good. A devolution of consciousness would be to create a future that is subservient to your unconscious shadow ego, which we'll talk about shortly.
Yeah. And that co-creation or that manifestation is something we talk about a lot with subscribers, FLFE subscribers, that as you rise in consciousness, there seems to be a general principle that there's more power. It's what Dr. Hawkins had taught, more power to manifest, to create the life that you want to create. And as you move up into, say, in the 500s on the Hawkins map, the love zone, and higher up, that you're including more and more of creation as benefiting from what you're manifesting.
Yeah, we could say it's more fun in life, more laughter, things like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, laughter seems one of those universal with divinity, that these people that channel, or if there's connection across the veil, there seems to be always laughter, which is, I don't know. It's very reassuring to me.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems that in the higher consciousness channelings, or wherever you get your information, joy and laughter is a sign of truth.
So we talk about in these podcasts a lot about high consciousness fields in general, and high ones being, of course, high up on the map of consciousness, in 500s in the love zone or up higher. And that in those high consciousness zones or environments, just like in a high place like a cathedral or a mosque or wherever there's a lot of loving devotion to a higher power, or in a pilgrimage zone where people go for specific purposes, we're supported to rise naturally. And so we've talked about that in other podcasts. So in FLFE now, the high consciousness field starts at 550. You can move it up to 570. And what's our current increase on average over the first 90 days, Clayton, in the field?
Yeah, it seems to be going up over the years, and right now it's stable at about 30 points on average. Mm-hmm. Now some people are, go up a little more, some people a little less. Mm-hmm. But 30 points is a significant increase on the Hawkins scale because it's logarithmic. So 1 point mm-hmm. higher is 10 times more power. So if you were at, say, 510 on the Hawkins scale of consciousness and you went to 511, you have 10 times more power to create the life you want.
Mm-hmm. So in a high consciousness zone, or it seems any positive environment, there's a natural evolution that's happening, and then of course there's taking action or having the intention to grow, to do personal work on the path of evolution of our own personal consciousness. And of course there's larger scale, societal consciousness. So in the in the personal side of things, the personal growth or work on consciousness, what are some of the areas that, some of the tools or areas that we will work on?
Yeah, well, there's kind of the practical thing. If people are looking to experience what a higher level of consciousness is, they could, see if they can apply it to create more value in the world and receive more money for that value, to receive money in ways that are outside of just working, like winning it or being gifted to you or finding it or manifesting it in some way that's perhaps even outside of your understanding. We're just talking about money because it represents survival. We're going to talk a lot about the ego today. For some people, it's just finding a parking spot, We have one of our staff looking for a place. We're just talking to Maria earlier, and she's got superpowers in finding a place, a home, a new home. So in that part of her life, she would have, I think, a really high level of consciousness, Jeff. Mm-hmm. And there's other aspects of this, of course. There's just having more joy in general. Mm-hmm. And a higher level of consciousness typically is associated with seeing areas where you struggle or mm-hmm. feel held back. Mm-hmm. Although when you're kind of in the middle of it, you're in the middle of it all, right? So mm-hmm. There's still struggles, of course, but mm-hmm. as a general rule of thumb.
Yeah, for me, finding those joy zones, those places where everything comes easily. Mm-hmm. It's like my gifts are being fully utilized. And that's where, spending more time in those, to me, is a advancement forward, into more joy, more love of life, and higher consciousness. And then, it's seen where it's hard, things don't happen easily. Things don't move forward. We're stuck. I'm stuck on the same thing for weeks and weeks. Well, rather than being frustrated by it, which is natural, and I certainly go there, but like, okay, there's an opportunity. What's holding me back? What's the unconscious pattern or belief or habit, and we're going to get much more into that. That's could be holding me back, and it's not conscious. Like my intention is to go to the next step, and I just don't get there. And that's commonly called shadow. That unconscious holding you back, something you're not aware of, something that's not accepted. But let's go into we love getting our definitions high. There's Jungian, definitions of shadow. There's Freudian definitions of shadow. And we've kind of taken a synthesis of those and added some other things to it in order to come up with a high definition of shadow. You want to take us through that, Clayton?
Yeah. So when we're looking at creating definitions, we use references such as, the Oxford Dictionary is the highest consciousness dictionary in the world. Wikipedia is not really that high, but sometimes the definitions are helpful. And also, I think in North America, it's the Webster Dictionary that's more common. We typically don't use that because the Oxford is the highest one. So, and we also take information from classical, spiritual, and religious literature. So it's really finding truth is where you find it, as they say. So this definition of shadow is very contextual in that it's personal shadow. So personal shadow is the unconscious aspect of oneself. It is essentially the singular issue and the total of all negative aspects of the persona that have been disowned from the personal self. Traits that are what we normally perceive as being inferior, evil, or unacceptable. Acting on or even acknowledging these traits would cause a person to have a negative perception of themselves. These types of undesirable traits, which not openly acknowledged, are a common factor amongst humans. And so then we gave an example. There is an aspect of all of our mind that wants to dominate others, as the mind perceives that it has an increased chance of survival if it does so. So we've talked about this a lot, Jeff. When we talk about it in the company, we talk about it in our personal lives. There is a default to the mind, and its job is really to help us survive, and we just have to remember that. And it thinks it is going to increase its chance of helping us survive if it is dominant. And it's an interesting thing to keep out in front of you.
Yeah. If that's unconscious, we may be doing it and not realizing it. And yet to know that that's part of all of our minds. And that to me is important, that it's not just me, it's everybody has this. Because a lot of shadow, it seems, when I've come up upon things that I don't like about myself, then there can be shame around that, or, why aren't I better? Why aren't I higher consciousness? But if it's really just something that's common to everyone, and it's part of the survival of the biological being, that's been built into us at some point.
Yeah, it seems to be hardwired. I'm sure the brain psychologist, or the whatever that specialty is, they would talk about the amygdala and the reptilian center, and how that's activated when we're in certain situations. There is other aspects of the mind that are trying to help us survive by not just dominating. It could be to deceive, or to divide and conquer, subterfuge. There's many different aspects of that, or expressions of it. It's just not, I want to be bigger and stronger. or just I want to have more money than you. There's a lot of aspects of this, but we wanted to give an example so that we're not just talking in theory here.
And we're tending to use mind rather than ego, though, ego is also used and, is probably more tied to the Freudian theories. So we're talking about these shadow pieces in us that are unconscious, that might be running the show in some ways, and we don't know it. So I guess one of the key pieces is, how do we find those? How do they show themselves so that we can use it as an opportunity? Again, the perspective here, for this episode, is rising in consciousness, is growing ourselves into more joy and love and an experience of life that's abundant. So, the shadow work, as it's called, or shadow opportunity, part of it is recognizing where those shadows are. For me, it's like we talked about, it's that blockage, is one thing. It's like, I want to move forward. I have the intention to move forward. I'm taking a few steps, and zing, I'm like back to square one. It's like there's a giant rubber band that's all these unconscious patterns or beliefs or shadow or whatever it is that's saying, no, you're not doing that. So there's a big red flag for me. Like, okay, what's there? What's there to look at?
Yeah. You don't have to go very far looking for shadow. One of the great things, personally, about setting goals is that you have something to measure your progress in life against. And the great part about professional careers like accounting and engineering is you have a standard that you need to adhere to and rise to in terms of your understanding and application of mathematical principles. And setting goals is a way of using a mathematical principle to help you move forward. And, you can look at the world and see what other people set, but then you have to be aware of too much comparison, right? Just recently, I seem to be doing a lot of financial planning. I'm at that age where it's becoming more and more important. And so you look at these, standardized tables of how much, you need to live on in retirement if you're not working. Now, I don't ever plan to really stop working totally, so it's a different context, I would say. But having a goal and having to move towards it is an opportunity for you to take a look at what's holding you back. And so that's one of the great things about goal setting. And if you say, well, I just want to be happy and live in the moment, that's okay. That's great. And if you're not happy and living in the moment, then there's your opportunity to look at your shadow. What's holding you back? Are you able to live an abundant life in whatever way, you do that? That's integrous. So it doesn't typically take that much work to find your shadow. Yeah.
And sometimes it can be a physical feeling in the body. For me, it's around my throat, kind of high, hard throat area. And I call it a hairball. It feels like just a tightness there when I think about doing something or somebody or, something that I want to move forward on. And I just get that tight feeling. It's like, there's something going on there. So it may show up in the body somewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, our body's extremely intelligent in how it wants to process out negative energy. The theory that we sort of hold to is that if you have a shock or trauma, it's held in the aura. And that the body, when you have these sensations, is literally telling you where the energy is being released through. and it has a lot of innate intelligence on where it should do that. And so if you're able to be quiet enough, you can notice these sensations in the body. And some people feel a sensation and label it as anxiety or fear or even anger. And it's very helpful at times to disconnect the sensation from a feeling. Because once you have a feeling or you identify a feeling or label it, the mind loves to grab that and make a story out of it. And stories of the past, Jeff, like, when you had something happen to you as a kid or 5 or 10 years ago, or even last week, and you keep playing that story, or that story keeps playing in your head, or you keep playing that story in your head. And this time you have the right things to say and you have the right, state to be in. That's typically, that's a sign of an unprocessed shock or trauma, which is a form of shadow. There's something about that situation that you haven't made peace with. And so another definition of being free of shadow, I think, would be to be at peace. And it's in some philosophies, they say that the goal is to be neutral. But at least in the work of Dr. David Hawkins, which we refer to quite a bit, neutrality calibrates around 250 on the Hawkins scale of consciousness, where love calibrates at over 500, 500 and above. So that's an interesting distinction, that neutrality, at least in that definition, is not the ultimate state. And I've found certain people who've been trained, very well in a type of philosophical thinking, their goal is to be neutral. And if you were looking at different bodies of work, that's their ultimate state. So, you have to determine for yourself if that's true for you, if you feel like neutrality is the place you want to go to, and if there's possibly a version of neutrality that includes and transcends love. So when I've gotten into these conversations with people, sometimes that's where we end up, is that their definition of neutral is just different than the one that others have, probably including me.
So where would acceptance fit into that? Is acceptance in neutrality, or is it a higher or lower?
Well, at least in the Hawkins, on the Hawkins scale of consciousness, acceptance is around 350, and then reason is 400. The court system, judges, accountants, and the integrist profession is in the high 400s. And then when you get to 500, it becomes a love. So, for example, acceptance, Jeff, the way that I understand the Hawkins scale would be, acceptance would include and transcend the levels below it. So it would include courage, and if you go down below the level of integrity in the Hawkins map, it would include and transcend right from the bottom, right from shame, despair, anger, pride, courage, right, neutrality, and then acceptance would include and transcend all of those.
Yeah, we'll talk about acceptance as part of the process of working with shadow. I think one of the other clues about shadow, and maybe it relates to the childhood stories, is a trigger.
Yeah.
Being sort of outsizedly, reactive to something. It's like something happens, somebody says something, and it's like, 10 out of 10, when really it should have been a 2 out of 10, response. So seeing that in myself, like, whoa, there's the emotion part of it, and it's kind of a feeling in the body too, like adrenaline, heart racing, maybe a flush. So there seems to be both emotional and a body sensation around triggering.
Yeah, that disproportionate response is really interesting to observe in yourself and others. And, there's sometimes you go into an area and the other person is very likely going to have a reaction. And that's difficult because there's things you need to talk about that may be connected to that topic. And So you can sort of have a little bit of patience for people when you're going into an area where they're not that well resourced, you might say, put it that way. Yeah. Kind of know what's going to come.
So once we've found these juicy shadow pieces, and I like to think of it that way, they may be things that I've shoved down or that they're shameful in some, perspective, but that they're really opportunities to move to peace and to move to joy in life. So once we've found some pieces, what are the steps?
Yeah. It's interesting, if people have known you for a long time, they typically know your stuff. And it's funny you said messy, because messy is one of those shadow pieces. I mean, cluttery, a cluttery, dirty environment is a shadow piece. And it's literally, at the extreme of that, you go to hoarding, right? So I guess one way we could deal with it is we could, invite a reality TV show to come and help us clean up our place. And, that'd be great. We can get paid and get our house cleaned up for hoarders.
We won't show my desk right now. Yeah.
Our desks are not on camera. No.
I got the sticky note, I got a plague of sticky notes happening right now.
Yes. I have a herd of sticky notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a messy herd. It's not an orderly herd.
No. These cattle need to be wrangled. Yeah.
So I guess, that first step is acknowledging it. Acknowledging that it's, well, first of all, within all of us. Back to that, what we talked about earlier, it's like, it's not just me. It's within really everybody. So acknowledging that.
It's part of the human condition.
Yeah.
Yeah, it expresses a bit different in different cultures. Like in Japan, they talk about losing face, or in the Asian cultures in general. And in the Western culture, it may be more about, we tend to worship entrepreneurs right now at this time in our society. At a different time, say the Renaissance era, the people who were like the Leonardo da Vinci's, right, were the sort of idols of the time. And at different times, it would have been maybe religious leaders. And if we're in a certain culture, we might have individual role models within those cultures. So,
it seems to be, certainly happens in the guru world as well, where there's someone being held up as being very high, and that there's a fall, and that something lower, dark, something we don't like, maybe about ourselves, or has come out. They've in their behavior or their history or something. And it's just part of acknowledging that even though we have these role models, these heroes, these exalted teachers, that they all have it. They have everything too. They have these shadows as well.
Yes. Yeah, and they may be very high. They may have overcome most of their shadow or all of it in some parts of their life. And having been around a few very high consciousness people, there is still a personality, and there's that place that they seem to go to where they're beatific almost, and extremely. I tend to think of it as real resourced, or they're just a very, very high consciousness person in several parts of their life, and it's pretty impressive to be around them. Yeah.
So step one, acknowledge that it's within all of us. Step two,
accept that it's part of you.
It's not just them out there. Yeah,
no,
it's
not
in
just
us
them.
too.
Yeah. That's a nice one to skip over once in a while. Just kind of just go right to
Maybe
3.
you should work on that shadow in yourself. Yes.
Yeah.
So accepting that it's part of us and it's there.
Yeah, and then number 3. What's that one, Jeff?
So it's interesting. these things pop up in different ways. So it's expressing or identifying how it's expressing in our life. So if we go back to that survival by dominating others, unconscious shadow or belief, then how's that showing up? Where's it showing up in my life? Like, where am I unconsciously trying to dominate others in order to be okay, to survive? And so it's identifying where these are showing up in our life.
Like my pickup truck is bigger than yours. I
think yours is bigger than mine right now.
Oh, you get right the 2 inch. You get the 2. Yeah, right now. Yeah, exactly. You get a 2-inch lift. I'm going to get a 3-inch lift. Oh, I'm going to get a 3-inch lift. I'm going to get a 4-inch lift. You got 31-inch tires. Oh, I think I need some 33s. I mean, that's kind of funny, but
I hadn't thought about that one as being a domination piece, but yeah, it's like a comparison to others and wanting to be better than. Yeah.
It's kind of male. The male example, but women could do it through. They have the genders have their own ways of doing it. I think just poking fun at ourselves is probably the safest way to get through this, Jeff.
Yep. So what about number 4 there, Clayton?
Number 4 on how to work with your shadow is to work on transcending it through love of self, others, and all of creation. So we've acknowledged that it's in us. So it's within all of us. We accept that it's part of us. We identify how it's expressing, and then we work on transcending it through love of self, others, and all of creation.
Yeah, that love of self is first. Because that's, like just that shame of, oh man, I'm doing that. And, I thought it was better. I thought it was higher consciousness. I thought I was, more evolved in other ways. But no, it's that love of self coming back to that forgiveness and love.
Yeah, it's a big topic. I mean, I got into a conversation last week with somebody about, in the office where we measure the level of consciousness of the field between the employees, right? That's part of our cultural kind of metrics that we use. And we measure that on a scale parallel to the Hawkins scale of consciousness. And it's a little bit technical, but it's basically how well do people get along? How well do we treat each other? And it was noted by somebody that certain people in the office are very good at creating a high consciousness or loving field amongst the staff, and they're not as good at that as they are. Let's reframe this. They are better at creating a high consciousness field than loving themselves. So they're better at creating an environment out there than they are at loving themselves.
So they skipped the loving self step and went to the loving other step. Yeah.
Yeah, or creating an environment where people feel loved, which is, I think, really close. We got into this conversation. We were trying to, get those delineations and distinctions, and I don't think that conversation is done. It's a really interesting one.
Yeah, maybe that's another survival piece, is having others love themselves, or creating a loving environment so that you're included. People want you back.
Yeah, that would be a more subtle form of ego than the bigger tires on the bigger truck, I think. Yeah, that's a lot more subtle. But nonetheless, I think the person was pointing this out. I think it's true in that situation. Yeah.
So it's taking the time to do this, to really work on love of self, love of others, and love of all of creation. So how does it fit into the bigger picture? So that, it's key to have the time, to have the quiet time to do that. And there's a lot of techniques out there about self-love and We won't get into a lot of detail in this episode about that.
Yeah, I mean, when we're looking at when we're screening people for hiring, we measure the level of consciousness of their intent towards business, towards the government, towards the company, and it's a way of understanding how much love they have in their life. It's paradoxical that if you want to come and work for a company, that your level of conscious of your intent towards business in general is low. Now, in some ways, business has earned that because of the things that have been done by business or in the name of business. And you could also draw that metaphor towards, say, church or God, the things that have been done in the name of God or in the name of religion. And every religion has had people rationalize behavior that is sometimes horrendous because it's in the name of God or in the name of a religion or in the name of a church or in the name of, inside the government or, business, as we talked about. There's a lot of ways to rationalize negative behavior. And so it's really easy to get an attitude that business or church or the government or religion is unethical, non-integrous, bad, whatever you want to call it. The paradox is that it seems that love is the only thing that can really change the systems in ourselves and these big issues. But the judgment keeps us away from being loving. Yeah, that's a paradox.
And just to know, in those organizations, whether government, business, different businesses, they're all people with the same shadow, same struggles, same evolution on whatever path they're on.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one conversation with a guy that worked in a governmental agency, and I was frustrated with something I was trying to get done, and we had lunch one day and we were talking, and he's saying, they're just people, they're just doing a job, they're just trying to make a living. And we ended up talking about that for probably an hour. And he had worked in that for so long, and he had made peace with it. Basically said, we are the government. Of course, we make the laws, we change them, we modify them, and we can totally cancel them, rewrite them. There's a big issue right now before the courts in the U.S. Hey, Jeff, Roe versus Wade.
Yeah,
that's huge. That's a huge one. So we are the government. We make the laws. And after he sort of talked me through that, I don't know what happened, but my attitude about government definitely up-leveled. And in fact, I had a couple of really weird experiences where I called this agency to get something done, and it just happened effortlessly. Like, it was like, oh, they said, oh yeah, well, you just, you made a mistake here in this form. And so it kind of got stuck in the system, but why don't we just change this right now? This is being recorded, so do you say this is the correct answer? I said, yeah. So they changed it, and then something got fixed like right away, where it was like weeks and weeks of drama trying to get hold of people, waiting for an hour on the phone. I literally picked up the phone, called, it rang, I got somebody, they put me through, and it was like 2 minutes, it was done.
And that was after coming to peace.
That was after that conversation. Yeah, with this guy, Rob was his name. And I remember the conversation. He worked in government, then he worked in the police. And now I think, he was in a very high place of being at peace with how the government works and how the system works, if you want to call it that. And I had a couple of experiences within the next 2 weeks that were very different than what I'd had before. And I kept most of that. I don't think I kept all of it because he was really, really high in that area. But I think I went over the tipping point, when you go from being frustrated with something to, well, I guess frustration's probably maybe close to anger at 150 on the Hawkins scale.
Mhm.
And I'm certainly that he took me over 200 that day just being in his presence. And,
Mhm.
I don't know how high it is now, but for me, that's a real practical example
Mhm.
of an unconscious part of myself that I assumed, based upon my relationship with government after, had changed. Now, how can I prove that? I don't know, but my experience is very different.
So that's one technique or one way to transcend an issue is to be around people who already have.
I already have it. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe we'll hit some of those other techniques, and then we'll come back to one of the things you're really good at, putting things out in front. Yeah, so being around someone that's like the grace of the guru, we've talked about that before. So someone's in a high consciousness in a certain area, and so being around them up levels us. Just being in their field, in their consciousness field.
Yes.
And, another technique of transcendence is surrendering to a higher power, to God, to divinity, to however you experience that, which is, in the first case, you're in someone's field who's higher. And in this case, you're in the divinity field, which is even higher, most likely, in the at least 850, right? If you surrender to a higher power.
Yes, if you're measuring the level of consciousness of the technique, when you include spiritual will, which is invoking the will of a power greater than yourselves, then the level of consciousness of that technique goes to 850, and it could be even higher than that.
Mm-hmm.
That spiritual will is the key factor there in surrendering to divinity.
Mm-hmm. So that's a transcendent method, of course, one of the fastest and most complete, and could mean therapy.
Yeah.
Just talk therapy with a psychiatrist or psychologist to, dig into those corners and try to surface, maybe a childhood incident or something that you have suppressed. Energetic medicine, you've got a lot of experience there.
Yeah, the classic ones that are known are the Gary Craig's work, the tapping. There's a lot of energetic medicine techniques out there. I mean, we won't get into a lot of details in this conversation, but if you just do some searching around, you'll find lots of information on energetic medicine. Yeah, that's a big one.
Joy therapy, we talked about that earlier. It's like go out and enjoy yourself, do something really positive. It's almost like your experience with government, like you had it almost sounds to me like you had a joyful experience of government in calling that number and getting such a fast response.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't until it was all over that I realized how different it was than what I experienced in the past. Yeah, it was kind of almost funny, actually. It's like, what was the big story about that I was making up, And generally now I don't have much of a hard time dealing with government. I mean, I don't really like it sometimes, but it's slower than I'd like and maybe more expensive, but some of the edge is gone anyway, probably most of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be, grace of the guru, but this joy therapy, it's life looks different when you're at 35,000 feet. When you're really in a good place, it's healing. It reframes. My experience is that it reframes the past. You have more acceptance and compassion for that other part of yourself that struggled with it for years.
Mm-hmm. So getting yourself, or when you're in a high vibration, or getting yourself in a high vibration, and then bringing this issue into, like, bringing it in.
Bring it in, yeah.
Yeah, like bringing it into the sun and shine the light on the shadow.
Yeah, if you're use the government for example, if you're in a pretty joyful place most of the day and you have to do something to deal with the government, and you think you can get it done in a relatively short period of time, you can use the joy and the energy of positivity to go into that space and come out knowing that you have the joy within you still.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're starting to get cranky because you're on hold for half an hour, then you can hang up and call back again, and maybe you'll get through in a few minutes. Mm-hmm. But you keep yourself in the joy zone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And of course, another technique for transcendence of the shadow is time in a high consciousness field, which, we really talked about being around somebody that's high consciousness in the subject, surrendering to divinity. Again, that's even higher consciousness field. And then there's a high consciousness environment, whether it's a place that you always go to pray and to contemplate, really special place for you in your home or somewhere outside, or even a place of worship. In the FLFE environment, high consciousness field. We'll talk a little bit more about shadow in a high consciousness field, but that's another way to transcend.
Yeah, and often spending time in a high consciousness field will get you into a more joyful state, a loving or joyful state. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg there, you get both the chicken and the egg in that situation.
Yeah, I've noticed when I'm working on something and it pops, kind of the final piece goes, there is that like joyful, surge that happens. Doesn't happen every time, but it does when I'm using an energetic medicine technique and I'm working on something. And then when it finally pops, there is that joyful piece that happens.
Yeah, it's like the energy was stagnated and then it releases. I mean, I feel literally talking about popping, I'm thinking about chiropractic treatments. Like when I go to a chiropractor, sometimes, there is a pop. Oftentimes it's just proprioception by the chiropractor, kneading on the sore spots. But I go to an old school chiropractor, and I've tried some of these newer ones. So I'll probably move more towards new styles. But when they do an adjustment, there's sometimes a kind of a click or a pop, and then the energy flows, and it's just, you leave there kind of giddy. Yeah, that's a good metaphor.
So one of the things that wouldn't have been on my list normally was winning big in your life. that was, where did that come from? That was interesting. I guess that's, being in joy, being in a high field or in joy, but like winning in your life as a way to heal and have shadow things appear maybe more easily.
Yeah, when we were planning this, it was an interesting thought that came up. There seems to be some distinction between being in joy and maybe it's a higher level or if it's just a wider level, but winning big in your life and being in a great place, like not just temporarily, but just really winning. I don't think it's the same, but it's similar to that, that metaphor of being in a plane and looking down at the world and things you have a different perspective. And there's, I guess for me, winning big is having a lot of resources to bring to bear on a topic, whereas you could be joyful and be broke, but winning big is having resources. And, it's typically when we talk about resources, we talk about time, energy, and money in business anyway. But if you have lots of time because you're able to delegate things and you have a life where you can afford to delegate to people, then you have the time part and energy. If you have, money to have, eat decent food and have a nice place to live and, a vehicle if you need it, whatever you need to do to have a happy, energetic life. And then money, when you have that magic formula where you've got time, energy, and money to use, that's kind of what I think the winning big thing means to me anyway, Jeff.
It could be that uncomfortably successful
piece,
right?
Yeah, right on the other edge of winning big is like, this is getting uncomfortably good. And you may not say that to yourself, but you'll notice you do little things to kind of slow it down,
And there's that. So there's the shadow showing itself.
There's a shadow, yeah.
So maybe more clearly there it's appearing because you're successful and uncomfortably so. Okay, well, why am I uncomfortable?
Yeah. And you may not put those two thoughts together, but all of a sudden you start self-destructing, right? It's like something's going on.
Yeah, important shadow work to get on. Yeah. So in a high consciousness field, say in the FLFE environment or other place that you may go to, let's talk about what are the characteristics of working with shadow with that support of that high consciousness environment.
Right. So the benefits of working in a high consciousness field, because FLFE that's what it's really all about. Well, I think the first thing that came up on our list, Jeff, was that being in a high consciousness field is you feel safer.
Mm-hmm.
You're not like looking over your shoulder, watching your back.
Mm-hmm.
There's more calmness and relaxation, and that allows you more space to work on things. At least probably more energy and maybe more time.
Yeah, it seems in that level of love field, like the FLFE environment, that we can be more loving to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's such an important part of that transcendence is forgiving and loving ourselves. So it's kind of a more kind, more forgiving, more loving environment when you're at that, mid to high 500s on the Hawkins map.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. And when we were planning this, we talked about it being easier to acknowledge personal deficiencies, if that's the right word, in self and others in a higher, safer feeling environment with more light, so to speak. It's almost like you can afford to acknowledge your deficiencies because there's more capacity in the environment to manage it, right? You don't have to worry about people backstabbing you or, it's kind of a slang word, but you don't have to worry about a lot of that petty stuff that goes on when people are bickering and arguing with each other and only looking out for themselves.
Yeah. So in the high conscious environment, you feel like you're in the love zone, more forgiving, more loving, that's just easier to acknowledge those. It's safer to acknowledge those deficiencies where it's not so safe. So, low consciousness field or a low area where there's low people, where there is that self-centering and, like you said, backstabbing.
Yeah.
And, I'm glad that, we're at this time in history and where we live that it's actually not knives. That's the backstabbing.
Yes. It's the thoughts or the metaphors. Yeah.
Yeah. And that positioning of dominance, so acknowledging your deficiency in that environment is, no, you're not, that's dangerous. You're going to keep that to yourself.
Oh yeah, no, it's like showing a vulnerability. It's, I talk to different people in business in particular, and they use metaphors of thinking of the business as a wolf pack, and they're the alpha male. And because I did coaching for 25 years, and a lot of them were business owners. I typically worked with business owners or senior management people. And when they used metaphors of where, there's only one person that could be the alpha or the dominant, that typically means they're in that kind of way of thinking, which is the self-centered, ego-based thinking. And it, it's, I don't like to spend a little time around those people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to have a casual metaphor just to try to give an example, but when it's a way of being and a way of relating to the world, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in those situations, we take care of ourselves, kind of back to our boundaries conversation a couple episodes ago, and do our own work, and love and forgiveness. So I'd like to do a little metaphor related back to the big picture of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been talking about shadow and work with shadow as one part of our evolutionary process and how that's assisted in a high consciousness field. There's we've talked about lots of techniques for that and steps to sort of recognize, acknowledge, and love and forgive ourselves and others. Is the idea of a lamp, like that. You could use the metaphor of like a multifaceted glass enclosed lamp with a light inside, and that light is our own personal light that's always there shining. You could say that part of divinity in ourselves, or the good in ourselves, however you want to look at it, and that this work, in this case, the shadow work, where they're kind of cleaning those panes so the light can shine out, or we're putting a Band-Aid on it. I love that. We're putting a Band-Aid on it, which is going to block even more light. But man, we're going to hide that shadow deep, and it just means hiding our light.
Yeah, we're either putting the Band-Aids on or we're taking them off, one of the two.
Sometimes ripping those Band-Aids off can be a little painful.
Yeah, sometimes you want to just take them off nice and slow. And every once in a while, you grab one Band-Aid, pull it off, you get 4 or 5. Yeah, little grace there.
Bonus Band-Aids.
Bonus Band-Aids.
So what would you recommend, Clayton, for people to try at home around this?
Well, yeah, so closing thoughts. What I would recommend that people try is to remember that the thing you have the most control over in your life is you. You don't have control over your children or your spouse or your boss or your employees or the people you manage or the government or the environment or the economy or religion or anything outside of you. The most control you have is over you. And control isn't a bad word when used in this context. And so keep the emphasis on doing your own personal work. And when I first got into energetic medicine in a deep way, I made a list of 27 things in my life that I wanted to change. I remember that number exactly because it was a pretty long list. And probably still working on a few of them in different ways. But when I found a good tool, I made a list and I got to work on it. And so I would say keep the emphasis on you changing yourself and taking individual responsibility for your life.
Yeah, thank you, Clayton. Well, thank you for joining us in this episode. We're glad to have you with us on this Band-Aid pulling episode. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Take care. Thank you for joining this episode of Fields of Consciousness, a podcast for consciousness conversations. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a no credit card free trial of Focused Life Force High Consciousness Environment for 15 days.
If you like, you can subscribe to Fields of Consciousness podcast, and please tune in next time. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11:11 a.m. PST. Onward and upward.